Okay, sorry about that. All right, so these graphs look kind of weird, so I'm just going to have you guys do the first couple problems with an actual table to make this up. So I'm going to plug these values in for x. So whenever you make a table, you can always pick whatever values you want to plug in for x. There is a little bit of a thing that's going to be a restriction here, but we'll talk about that in a second. So I just made a giant table here. So if I plug these values in for x, right, this would just be 1 over -2. And if you want to think about that as a decimal or a fraction, that's completely up to you. This would be 1 over -1. That's going to be a nice number. Now, if you do 1 divided by, I don't know why I didn't write this in the table here. Okay, if you do 1 divided by -0.5, it would be like dividing $1 into 50 cents. So it's actually going to be, if I divide that by -0.5, it actually becomes -2. So if I'm dividing by a half, it's the same as multiplying by its reciprocal, which is why that number is going to be bigger. So if I divide by -0.25, it'd be like dividing $1 into quarters, and it's got a negative with it, so it's going to be -4. Okay, what would you do if I asked you to do 1 divided by 0? Can I do that? Is that defined? Like if you actually try to do that on your calculator, and it was scientific or graphing, it should give you an error message. So you're not allowed to divide something into 0 pieces. So if the easiest example I can think of that, like if you had a pizza and I said divide that into 0 pieces, you can't do that because you have a pizza, right? It's at least 1. So you cannot divide by 0. It's not defined. So this is going to create an asymptote on the graph, which we talked about that with our exponential. So these graphs will have asymptotes, but you cannot divide by 0. That is illegal, just like you can't take the log of a negative number, can't take the square root of a negative number. You cannot divide by 0. Okay, now the rest of the numbers in this table are just going to be the positive version of what we just wrote down. So if I do 1 divided by positive 0.25, this is +4. So it's going to be these same numbers we just wrote down. It's just going to go positive. So it should be 4, 2, 1, and a half. Okay, these are going to be a little tricky to graph because either probably in most of the points the x-coordinate or the y-coordinate is a fraction. So just do your best to try and estimate. So if I do -2, -1/2, just try your best to go kind of halfway in between the -1 and the 0. And then if I do, now -1, -1, that's a nice point. A half, just go halfway between -1 and 0, and then we'll go down to -2. And then -1/4, kind of go halfway between the half and go down to -4. And then I didn't do too many other numbers here, but I'm going to show you guys what this looks like. This curves into these points and makes this shape. It does not touch or go over the x or y axis. So this thing, that we call it a branch. And you're going to have another branch in a different quadrant that's going to be almost like a reflection of this, but in a different part of the graph. So that's going to come from the other points. So if I do this, +1/4 and then go up to 4, +1/2 go up to 2, 1, 1 is literally the only nice point on this graph, and then 2.5. And again, this is just it's not gonna touch or go over the x or y axis. It's just right there in that first quadrant. And I'm gonna draw in the asymptotes for this graph real quick. The asymptotes, though, are just gonna be the y-axis and the x-axis. So horizontal asymptote in that graph is the x-axis. So x equals 0, that's an asymptote. The vertical one, I'm sorry, the horizontal one would be y equals 0, and the vertical one is x equals 0. So it's the x and y axis. Those would be your two asymptotes. And if you guys don't know this, I might label this on one of these graphs at least. So the quadrants of the graph, you start in the upper left, like that's quadrant 1, and it goes around counterclockwise. So this would be quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. So this graph only exists in the first and third quadrants. And this is going to be a little bit tricky. So the domain and range for this graph. So if I think about domain, right, that goes from left to right, and that's talking about your possible x values. So as I go left and right, how would is there any number I don't touch in the domain? Is there any number that x is a problem for? 0, right? And we saw that in the table because I can't divide by 0. I'm not going to have you guys write the interval for this because it's really annoying because you basically just exclude 0. I'm just going to say it's all real numbers, but not 0 is what that means. If you're really interested, I will write it for this question. The interval, you would write it like this, -infinity to 0 with a parenthesis, and then you'd have a little union symbol, and it would start up again at 0 to positive infinity. I just don't want you guys to have to write that out. Basically what that does, that notation excludes your asymptote, which is 0. The y is going to be similar. One of these branches goes down forever, one of them goes up forever, but it doesn't touch the x-axis. So this goes from bottom to top. This is actually identical to what we just wrote. It's all real numbers, but it does not touch the x-axis. It doesn't exist at 0. So I'm excluding the two asymptotes. And you guys, if you want to just use that abbreviation, it's way faster than writing out the interval because it has 2 pieces. But that interval notation for the range would be exactly the same. Okay, now I'm just going to change one thing and have you guys graph. All I did was change the top of the fraction to be -1. Does anybody know what that would do to the y values? Like if you looked at the table we just did, and all I did was change up the top of that fraction, right? The only thing I'm going to change is the negative. How would that change the points? It just changes all the signs. That's literally it. So like when you do this, this would be -1 divided by -2, so this is just +1/2. This guy would be -1 divided by -1, so it's +1. So it's the same numbers we just wrote down. They're just going to flip the signs. So this is going to be 2, this is going to be 4. Now, still, I cannot divide by 0, so that's going to be a problem. So we're not going to have a point there. That would be an error. So -1 divided by 0 is just as bad as 1 divided by 0. And then the rest of these, if I do -1 divided by a positive 0.25, that's going to make that -4. So this is just going to flip these numbers. Same numbers we wrote in the table, we're just switching anything that was positive to be negative. So let me get back on here. Now, what you're going to see on the graph, this is actually going to have the same, let's see if I can fit this on here. It's going to have the same asymptotes. The branches are just going to be in different quadrants. So if I do -2 +1/2, it's going to be up here. If I do -1 +1, it's up here. -1/2, we're up at 2, and -0.25, we're up at 4. The branch, just from the graph we have below, it's just going to flip that branch up. So it's in, instead of being where it was in quadrant 3, now this is in quadrant 2. And if you graph this guy, this is just going to flip your other branch over. So I have, let's see, what am I doing? This is at -4, -2. I'm just graphing these points in the table the best I can. So then this branch is going to flip down from quadrant 1, and it's going to be in quadrant 4. That's literally the only difference. So if you have a positive k value on the top of that fraction, then your branches are going to be in quadrants 1 and 3. If you have a negative number on top of it, it's going to be in quadrants 2 and 4. Okay. What would the domain for this graph be? Same. It's exactly the same. This is all real numbers, but not the asymptote, which is 0. Your asymptotes here would be x equals 0 and y equals 0. It's just the x and y axis. And then your range, identical. One of these branches goes down forever, one of them goes up forever, but we don't touch the x-axis, so the range is also all real numbers, but not 0. Okay, now I'm going to do this real quick because I just spent a lot of time going over questions on the homework. So I'm not going to have you guys do this. I'm just going to pull up my Desmos real quick. And this just says if we compared these graphs, like how does changing the k value change the graph? So I'm just going to graph y equals, let's see, what do we have? 2 over x. So that's red, right? Okay, now I'm going to do y equals 4 over x. That's blue. And then I'm going to do y equals 8 over x. And then that's green. So what happens as I make that k value increase? If you're looking at those graphs, do you guys see the difference here? So it's that same shape. It's in that quadrant. The bigger the number on top, though, it's going to pull that branch away from the origin. It takes the same shape, it just pulls it further away from the center of the graph. So it's not going to change the shape. It's going to still have the same domain and everything else. It's just going to pull it away from the origin. So this just says, how does increasing the k value affect the graph? I would say the bigger k is, the farther from the origin. That's all it's going to do. So like if I had k was 20, here I can tell you what, I'll just show you. If I made it 20, so y equals 20 over x, it just pulls it. You guys can see that's that next one that it just pulls it away from the origin. It's the same shape, it's in the same quadrants, it's just the same asymptotes, everything, same domain, same range, it's just kind of further away. So the bigger your k value, the further it is. Now, right underneath that, it says just do that with the negatives. Literally all that's going to do, if I put a negative on each one of these, it just changes the quadrant that it's in. So it's the same distance from the origin and everything else, but that negative number is just going to switch which quadrants it's in. So all it is, this would just be quadrants 2 and 4. That's the only difference. If the k value is positive, you're in the quadrants 1 and 3. So changing that to a negative on top, it's just going to switch the quadrant. Wouldn't change the shape or size or anything like that. It just changes the quadrant. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you some general information here for these, and we are going to work on translating. We're not going to plot any specific points on these graphs. Okay. Whoops. All right, so I'm just going to make a little graph to show you this for each one. This is what I'm going to look for when you guys actually graph these. Just a general shape and the correct quadrants. So if the k value is positive, your 2 little branches are going to be quadrants 1 and 3. If your 2 little branches are going to be in quadrants 2 and 4, then that means your k value is negative. Same shape, they just kind of hug into the origin, just a little curve right in there, stays in that quadrant. And I'm just going to look for a general shape. Now, normally when we have shifted things around, I use h and k, but for these graphs, we have k as our constant of variation. So I actually used b and c to represent these translations here, but this works the same way. You cannot divide by 0. So if you have a translated graph and you have x minus some number down here, this is going to be the opposite of what this looks like, and that's going to move the graph left or right, which that's considered a horizontal translation. And whatever the c value is out here, this we would copy, and that is going to move your graph up or down. Now, I'm not really worried about how far the branches are from the origin. I'm really just going to look, do you have them in the correct quadrants? Now, the asymptotes, like, so what the branches would not touch on the graphs we did on the front is the x-axis and the y-axis. So those two numbers, the b and c, when you actually see them in an equation, that would affect where your x and y axis is. So this is the x is going to be equal to b. And this, I'm just going to write this. This would be, whatever that is, that would be a vertical line. That'll be your new y-axis. And y equals c. This would be where you would want to move your x-axis. Now, for the domain and range, remember, I'm not going to have you write out a big interval. This should just be all real numbers, but not whatever that b value is. That's what's going to set the denominator equal to 0, and you can't divide by 0. And then for the range, it's going to be all real numbers, but not whatever is added or subtracted to the side here. So that'll be c. And we're just going to do these on the graph. Really, the only thing you have to pay attention to about where to put the branches is what the number on top of the fraction is, the k value, whether that's positive or negative. So we're just going to go through here real quick. If it's with the x, it's going to affect left and right. So for this graph, what number would cause me a problem if I plugged it in for x? 3, right? All right, so this is going to be where x is 3. Why is my brain not functioning? Okay, so I'm going to shift my y-axis. X can't be 3. So we're going to move this over just 3 spots. So that's like my new y-axis, if you will. Now, you don't have anything added or subtracted, right? I just have that fraction. I don't have anything moving the graph up or down. So we're just going to leave the x-axis right where it's at. So x is going to be 3. Since you are not adding or subtracting anything, y is going to be 0. Horizontal line is just the x-axis. I know that's tricky, but that vertexal line there, that vertical line, that's x equals 3. That would cause us to divide by 0. This number on top, again, you're just looking, is that positive or negative? If that's positive, then you're just going to sketch your branches in quadrants 1 and 3, but based on how you shifted your x and y axis. So my quadrant 1 would be here, my quadrant 3 would be here. And I'm just looking for a sketch. For your domain and range, all you have to do for the domain, it should go with the x. It's all real numbers, but not 3, because that would cause us to divide by 0. And then for the range, all real numbers, you're getting really close to the x-axis, but you're not touching it, not going over it. So your y value will never hit 0. That's all you have to do. Okay, now the one next to this, I'm also going to be in quadrants 1 and 3 because that number on top is positive. It really doesn't matter what the number is, just whether it's positive or negative. And if you guys can see here, my problem number that would cause me to divide by 0 would be actually 0. So x cannot be 0. So you're not going to shift left or right. That's going to keep the y-axis right where it's at. The 2 is going to take the x-axis, it's going to move everything up 2 spots. So just literally take your entire x-axis, move it up 2 spots. And then just pretend that's your new x and y axis. I'm just looking for a sketch of the branches. So quadrants 1 would be up here, and quadrant 3 would be down here. And I'm just looking for a general sketch. Try your best not to draw the branches so they don't go over the asymptotes. So they're kind of inside that little area there. So then x asymptote is your vertical one. So x is 0 because it can't be 0 because then it would cause me to divide by 0. The y, we're never going to touch 2. It just like gets really close to it but doesn't touch it, doesn't go over it. So that's your asymptote for your horizontal there. And then domain should go with the x. All real numbers, but you can't use 0. And the range should go with the y. All real numbers, but we're not going to hit 2. So it covers everything else on the graph, just not that specific line, whatever it is, positive, or in this case, positive 2 and 0. Okay, now I've got a diagonal translation here. This is still a positive number, so once we move the x and y axis, we're going to still put this in quadrants 1 and 3. Okay, -1, what number is going to cause me a problem if I don't want to divide by 0? What would you plug in for x that would cause you to divide by 0? If I have x minus 1. 1. Okay, just checking. So x can't be 1. So that's where you're going to make your asymptote. It's just going to shift it 1 unit to the right. So if I'm looking at this, this is going to go right 1 and then the minus 5 and down 5. That's what's going on for my translation here. Opposite of what it looks like because it's what sets that equal to 0, and then copy whatever's outside. That's going to be your up or down. So this one I'm going to go down 5. So my new x-axis would be down here at negative 5. And my branches are still in quadrants 1 and 3. So based on my new x and y axis, that'd be quadrant 1. This is going to kind of probably go off the graph a little bit. That'd be quadrant 3. So x cannot be 1, so that's going to be your asymptote. Y is not going to hit negative 5. That's your horizontal asymptote. Domain, all real numbers, but not 1. And range, all real numbers, but we're not going to hit negative 5. And then the last one, you just got to be real careful. If they give you a negative number on the top, it doesn't matter what the number is, it just matters if it's positive or negative. That's going to put me in quadrant 2 and quadrant 4 instead of 1 and 3 like all the other ones. So just pay attention to that. Now, your problem number here that would cause you to divide by 0, that's how you're going to move left or right. This would be the x can't be negative 4, right? If I plug in negative 4, that causes me to divide by 0. So that's going to be my vertexal asymptote. And the positive 3 is going to move everything up 3 units, including your x-axis, so that would be there. If you had to describe this, this is going to be left 4 and up 3, if it asks you to describe it. That's all it is. The left and right comes from the bottom of the fraction. The up or down comes from outside the fraction. And then just be careful, this last one was different than the others. The branches should be in quadrant 2, which would be your upper left, and quadrant 4, which would be your lower right. Now, everything else works the same. As it doesn't matter. You still have one branch that goes up forever, one that goes down forever, one that goes right forever, and one that goes left forever. So the domain and range would be the same way you just did the last 3 questions. So x can't be negative 4, that's your asymptote. Y is not going to hit 3. Your domain, it's all real numbers, but we can't plug in negative 4 because that would cause us to divide by 0. And your range, you're going up and down forever there, but you're not going to touch the 3. Is anybody having a question?